In these frantic hours, the Kremlin teeters on the brink as reports flood in of a regime unraveling at its core. President Putin's iron grip slips away, with oligarchs bolting from Russia in private jets and yachts, their fortunes evaporating amid a cascade of defections and uprisings that shake the foundations of power. Eyewitnesses from Moscow's elite districts describe armored convoys racing through the streets, security forces clashing with protesters who number in the thousands, their chants echoing against the walls of the once impenetrable citadel. State media scrambles to contain the chaos, but leaked documents reveal a inner circle fracturing, key advisors vanishing into the night, while regional governors declare emergency autonomy in moves that defy central command. The gasoline crisis in Crimea has ignited a nationwide inferno, with fuel riots spreading to St. Petersburg and Siberia, where lines at pumps stretch for kilometers and tempers ignite into full-scale brawls. Sources inside the FSB whisper of purges gone awry, arrests of 20 high-ranking officials in a single dawn raid, but the backlash builds as military units hesitate, some refusing orders to fire on crowds swelling to 50,000 strong. Oligarchs like Abramovich and Friedman, their empires worth billions, have already fled to London and Dubai, liquidating assets in a fire sale that drains the economy of hundreds of billions overnight. This isn't mere descent, it's a seismic collapse, with the ruble plummeting 20% in trading sessions that last mere minutes, banks shuttering branches amid runs that empty vaults of gold reserves built over decades. Families in the heartland pack belongings, highways clogged with vehicles fleeing urban centers, as whispers of a coup circulate from the shadows of Red Square. The urgency pulses, intelligence intercepts point to coordinated strikes from within, perhaps backed by exiled operatives, targeting the very symbols of control, the Kremlin walls, the state dachas, all under siege in a drama unfolding live. Moscow streets fill with barricades, where ordinary citizens join forces with disillusioned elites, their voices rising in a chorus that demands an end to the three-decade reign. As the sun sets on this day of reckoning, the question burns: what happens when the architect of empire watches his creation crumble from within? This spark threatens to consume the nation, pulling allies and adversaries into the vortex. But wait, because the layers run deeper, political facades shatter as the world reacts. To stay gripped by every pulse of this regime's downfall, subscribe now and enable notifications. You can't afford to miss the twists that redefine Russia. Now, let's dissect the political implosion at the heart of it all. Kremlin spokesmen issue defiant broadcasts, claiming absolute stability under Putin's unyielding leadership, yet the reality unfolds in stark contradiction as regional leaders in Siberia and the Far East announce independent resource controls, bypassing Moscow's directives for the first time in decades. Putin convenes an emergency council with his inner 20 members, vowing to crush dissent through federal decrees, but leaks reveal heated arguments where 7 advisors push for negotiations with opposition figures, exposing rifts that undermine the unified front portrayed on state television. Officially, the government labels the oligarch exodus as economic maneuvering by foreign agents, downplaying the flight of 15 key billionaires who have transferred assets totaling $500 billion to offshore havens in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands, while in truth, emergency flights from Vnukovo Airport carry not just families but encrypted data drives loaded with compromising files. Western capitals react with cautious opportunism. The White House coordinates with exiled Russian dissidents, promising sanctuary and financial incentives worth $2 billion to whistleblowers, even as they publicly urge restraint to avoid humanitarian catastrophe in a nation of 144 million souls. In Brussels, EU foreign ministers demand asset freezes on remaining oligarch holdings estimated at €300 billion, contrasting their calls for dialogue with behind-the-scenes support for pro-democracy groups inside Russia that have mobilized 50,000 supporters in underground networks. Kiev's leadership seizes the moment, with Zelensky addressing the international community to highlight the regime's fragility, advocating for targeted sanctions that could cripple remaining state coffers holding 1 trillion rubles in reserves, yet privately coordinating with NATO allies to monitor border movements of Russian troops numbering 200,000. The contradictions deepen. Moscow's UN ambassador accuses the West of orchestrating the collapse through cyber operations that disrupted communications for 6 hours across key ministries, ignoring their own history of suppressing protests that drew 1 million participants in 2012. Beijing's foreign ministry expresses measured concern, pledging continued economic ties valued at $100 billion annually, but signals a shift by delaying joint military exercises scheduled for next month, a subtle withdrawal that tests the limits of their strategic partnership. Ankara balances precariously, with Erdogan offering mediation services while Turkish intelligence tracks the influx of Russian capital into Istanbul banks, amounting to $20 billion in deposits that bolster local markets but strain diplomatic relations. Domestically, governors in 10 regions declare states of emergency, reallocating budgets of 50 billion rubles each to local security forces, directly challenging federal authority and revealing the hollow core of Putin's centralized power structure built over 24 years. State media spins tales of external aggression, but social platforms buzz with unfiltered videos of clashes involving 30,000 protesters in Moscow alone, where police hesitate to deploy the full force of their 80,000 riot units. The political theater intensifies. Putin's public address promises bonuses of 100,000 rubles to loyal military personnel, yet defections among mid-level officers reach 500 cases, with units in the Urals refusing redeployment orders that would pit them against civilian uprisings. International observers note the hypocrisy. Moscow demands sovereignty respect from neighbors while its own federation fractures into autonomous zones controlling 80% of natural gas fields. In London, exiled oligarchs lobby for regime change support, funneling £10 million to advocacy groups, contrasting the Kremlin's official narrative of resilience with the visible exodus that empties luxury enclaves of their elite residents. The web of deceit tightens. Emergency laws suspend elections in 15 regions, affecting 20 million voters, under the guise of national security, but this only fuels accusations of dictatorship from human rights organizations monitoring the unrest. As alliances waver, Putin's team debates concessions like releasing political prisoners numbering 2,000, a move that could appease crowds but signal weakness to hardliners within the security apparatus of 1 million strong. The contrast between proclaimed control and chaotic fragmentation paints a picture of a regime clinging to power through denial, where every statement masks accelerating disintegration. Yet, this political unraveling sets the stage for the forceful backlash brewing in barracks and streets alike. Security forces mobilize at breakneck speed across Moscow's outskirts, with elite battalions totaling 8,000 troops deploying in armored personnel carriers that rumble through barricaded avenues, their machine guns trained on crowds swelling to 60,000 in Red Square. Orders fly from the Kremlin bunker: suppress the uprising with non-lethal rounds first, escalating to live fire if pockets of resistance form, but hesitation grips the ranks as 20% of the capital's garrison, some 4,000 soldiers, report in sick or desert, leaving gaps that protesters exploit to overrun police stations holding weapons caches of 500 rifles. The tempo surges. FSB rapid response teams, numbering 1,500 operatives, raid oligarch compounds in the Rublevka district, seizing documents and vehicles worth millions, but skirmishes erupt when private guards, 200 strong, fight back with smuggled pistols, turning manicured lawns into battlegrounds littered with casings. Tanks roll out from storage depots near the city, a column of 30 T-90 vehicles positioning to encircle the protest epicenter, their turrets swiveling toward makeshift barricades built from overturned buses and debris. Explosions rock the night. Flashbangs and tear gas canisters launch in volleys of 50, dispersing clusters of demonstrators but igniting secondary fires that consume government buildings, forcing evacuations of 300 officials scrambling for safe houses. Regional commands fracture the chain. In Chechnya, Kadyrov's forces, 10,000 loyalists, vow allegiance but hold back reinforcements, citing local unrest that ties down 5,000 of their own in firefights with separatist sympathizers. The pace quickens relentlessly. Air assault units drop from helicopters over key bridges, securing spans that carry escape routes for fleeing elites, while snipers perch on rooftops, their scopes tracking leaders amid the chaos of 100,000 on the move citywide. Military police clash with defecting units in the south, where a brigade of 2,000 refuses to advance on Siberian rallies, instead joining locals to storm armories stocked with 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Radios crackle with urgent commands: redeploy aviation assets, 20 fighter jets, from airbases to patrol skies over St. Petersburg, where naval infantry of 3,000 secure the ports against sabotage attempts that sink 2 patrol boats in fiery blasts. The human surge intensifies. Medics ferry the wounded in ambulances racing through cordons, treating hundreds from baton charges that leave bruises and fractures, while command posts buzz with reports of mutinies in the Far East, where garrisons totaling 7,000 stand down, allowing protests to claim control of oil fields producing 1 million barrels daily. Artillery units remain cold, their howitzers silent as officers weigh loyalties, but special forces infiltrate opposition hubs, capturing 30 coordinators in dawn sweeps that yield laptops brimming with plans for nationwide strikes. The front lines blur into urban warfare. In Novosibirsk, clashes pit loyalists against rebels in street-to-street fighting, with grenade launchers barking from alleys and casualties mounting to 500 in hours of unrelenting exchanges. Moscow's inner circle activates contingency protocols, mobilizing reserve divisions of 50,000 to encircle the capital, but supply trucks bog down in traffic jams spanning 20 kilometers, exposing the fragility of logistics strained by the oligarchs' asset grabs. Drones swarm overhead, Russian Orlans clashing with improvised civilian jammers that disrupt signals across a 10-kilometer radius, forcing pilots to abort bombing runs on assembly points. The rhythm pounds on, elite Alpha Group storms the State Duma, detaining 20 parliament members suspected of treason, their arrests broadcast to deter the masses but instead galvanizing further outrage. Border guards tighten seals, turning back 10,000 would-be emigrants at checkpoints, while naval fleets in the Baltic, 40 vessels, go on high alert against potential incursions from NATO flanks. Tension coils like a spring, night raids claim another 200 arrests, but escapes mount as underground tunnels ferry dissidents to safety, their network spanning 5 major cities. Commanders bark overrides, accelerating deployments of electronic warfare teams to black out communications for millions, yet cell towers fall to sabotage crews who topple 3 in coordinated hits. The military apparatus strains at breaking point, Iskander launchers prime for urban suppression, crews loading warheads that could level blocks housing thousands, but moral qualms halt the triggers, with whispers of a palace coup rippling through the officer corps of 100,000 nationwide. Skirmishes flare in the Urals, where factory workers arm with tools turned weapons, clashing with patrols in battles that scar industrial zones and halt production lines churning out military gear for the front. As the maelstrom whirls, the raw force of fracturing loyalty lays bare the regime's hollow core, this scramble for control devolves into a civil tempest claiming lives by the score. But in the heat of this fury, subscribe immediately to track every eruption. The military tides turn swiftly, and staying informed means witnessing history's pivot. Now, the fallout cascades into economic realms, engulfing the world in its grip. Financial markets seize in panic as the regime's fissures widen, the Moscow exchange halting trading after the ruble craters 30% against the dollar, wiping out trillions in value from state-backed enterprises that once anchored an economy of $2 trillion. Oligarch flights accelerate capital hemorrhage, private jets ferry families and fortunes totaling $800 billion to safe havens in Switzerland and Singapore, where banks absorb deposits that inflate local currencies by 5% overnight. Russian oil giants like Rosneft face immediate shutdowns, halting exports of 7 million barrels daily through disrupted pipelines, sending Brent crude surging 12% to $120 per barrel and triggering global pump prices to climb 15 cents per liter in Europe alone. In Beijing, state planners scramble to reroute supply chains, their annual imports from Russia, valued at $150 billion, now at risk, prompting emergency stockpiling of natural gas reserves equivalent to 6 months' supply for their 1,400,000,000 citizens. Brussels convenes crisis summits, with the European Central Bank injecting €200 billion into markets to stem contagion from Russian bonds worth $500 billion that default en masse, affecting pension funds holding 10% of their portfolios in those assets. The scale expands coldly, worldwide stock indices plunge 7%, with energy sectors in New York shedding $1 trillion as investors flee to gold, which rallies 20% to $2,500 per ounce amid fears of prolonged instability. Crimea's isolation compounds the chaos, its ports idling ships loaded with grain exports of 20 million tons yearly, inflating world food prices by 4% and sparking shortages in Africa where imports from the Black Sea feed 80 million people. Moscow's central bank burns through foreign reserves of $300 billion in futile defense of the currency, while inflation erupts to 25% annually, eroding savings for 100 million households overnight. Geopolitically, alliances buckle, Ankara's lira weakens 8% as Russian capital inflows reverse, costing exporters $50 billion in lost deals, forcing Erdogan to seek IMF loans of $10 billion to stabilize banks teetering on collapse. Washington capitalizes, accelerating sanctions that freeze another $400 billion in oligarch assets across American jurisdictions, boosting U.S. LNG shipments to Europe by 3 million tons monthly at premiums of 20%, reshaping energy dependencies that once funneled 40% of Europe's gas from Russia. In Delhi, policymakers hoard commodities, adding 5 million tons to wheat reserves to buffer against price hikes that could add 3% to their inflation rate, affecting 1,300,000,000 consumers. The International Energy Agency warns of a 2 million barrel per day shortfall if Russian fields in Siberia, producing 50% of national output, fall to rebel control, potentially shaving 1.5% off global growth and idling factories in Germany that employ 200,000 workers reliant on cheap metals. Oligarchs fire sales flood markets, yachts and mansions valued at $2 billion auctioned in Monaco, while tech firms divest Russian software contracts worth $30 billion, crippling cybersecurity for state entities handling sensitive data on millions. Beijing hedges bets, diverting trade routes through Kazakhstan to handle 100,000 tons of goods daily, but tariffs rise 10%, straining a partnership that exchanged $200 billion last year. In Paris, Macron unveils a diversification fund of €50 billion for renewables, targeting a 20% cut in Russian energy reliance that still powers 30% of French households. Currency swaps between Moscow and allied nations total 100 billion yuan, but liquidity dries up as banks ration withdrawals to $1,000 per account, sparking runs that empty ATMs across 80 regions. Corporate empires crumble. Aluminum producer Rusal, controlling 20% of global supply, sees shares tank 15%, halting deliveries that feed automotive plants in Detroit producing 1 million vehicles annually. The cold arithmetic unfolds. Investor exodus from emerging markets reaches $500 billion, redirecting flows to U.S. treasuries that yield 4%, while commodity futures for nickel and palladium, Russia's staples, spike 25%, inflating costs for electric vehicle batteries worldwide by 10%. In Tokyo, electronics giants like Sony face component delays, projecting a 5% earnings dip as supply chains snag on sanctions blocking rare earths worth $15 billion yearly. This quagmire engulfs not just Russia but the interconnected globe, where one regime's fall cascades into recessions touching billions, factories shuttering and shelves emptying in a chain reaction of calculated detachment. Yet beneath the figures, livelihoods shatter in bankruptcies and breadlines stretching for the masses. Subscribe now to navigate these economic tremors. They reshape fortunes and frontiers with every passing hour. Now, as the ledgers close, we delve into the profound scars on the human spirit and the world's horizon. The regime's collapse burrows into the collective psyche like a shadow that no decree can dispel, leaving Russians from the frozen tundras to the bustling metros haunted by the ghosts of a promised eternity now reduced to rubble. In these shadowed hours, as barricades crumble and oligarchs vanish into exile, ordinary citizens numbering 100 million confront a void where certainty once stood, their daily rituals shattered by the echo of chants that swell to 200,000 voices demanding a rebirth from the ashes of 24 years of iron rule. Soldiers in fractured units, totaling 300,000 across the Federation, pause amid the fray to question the oaths that bound them, their rifles lowering as memories of lost comrades, tens of thousands fallen in distant fields, resurface in the silence between gunfire bursts. For the elites who fled, carrying briefcases stuffed with secrets worth billions, the flight evokes a hollow triumph laced with paranoia, hiding in villas abroad while families back home face interrogations that strip away illusions of invulnerability built over decades of unchecked power. This unraveling strikes at the heart. In Siberian villages, where miners once toiled for state glory, gatherings of 5,000 now whisper of betrayal, their faith in the system evaporating like morning mist, replaced by a gnawing fear that the wealth they extracted, trillions in resources, lined pockets that abandoned them to chaos. Ukrainians across the border feel the weight of vindication tempered by sorrow, over 40 million souls reflecting on scars from invasions that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, seeing this implosion as poetic justice yet dreading the refugee waves that could swell to 1 million crossing thresholds in search of sanctuary. Globally, the tremor resonates in boardrooms and homes alike. Europeans, reliant on Russian energy for 30% of their needs, grapple with an existential anxiety, wondering if the lights will dim for their 800 million in a winter of uncertainty, stirring debates on self-reliance that echo the fragility of alliances forged in the post-Cold War thaw. Philosophically, this moment unveils the illusion of permanence. What endures when a single man's grip, sustained through purges of thousands and manipulations of media reaching 90% of the population, dissolves into the ether? The human spirit fractures. Protesters in Moscow, their numbers peaking at 150,000, taste freedom's edge but recoil from the abyss of reprisals that could claim another 5,000 in the crossfire, their euphoria mingling with the terror of rebuilding a nation scarred by corruption that siphoned 500 billion from public coffers. In the quiet aftermath of clashes, families huddle around flickering screens, absorbing unfiltered truths that dismantle propaganda machines once dominating 100 channels, fostering a collective awakening laced with grief for the youth, 20 million strong, indoctrinated into a worldview now proven hollow. Exiled dissidents, scattered in networks spanning 50 countries, channel their exile's bitterness into calls for justice, their broadcasts reaching 10 million online, igniting global solidarity that questions the cost of authoritarianism on the human scale. For the world, it's a mirror to vulnerabilities. In Washington, policymakers confront the blowback of sanctions that isolated Russia but empowered rogue elements within, affecting alliances that safeguard $4 billion in trade flows. The psychological undercurrents deepen. Does this spark a renaissance of civil society, with grassroots movements mobilizing 2 million volunteers, or does it breed cycles of vengeance that entomb generations in resentment? Russian elders, witnesses to the Soviet fall 34 years prior, draw parallels in hushed tones, their wisdom warning of the spiritual toll on a people numbering 144 million, where trust in institutions plummets to single digits amid revelations of embezzlement totaling trillions. As convoys of the displaced snake through borders, carrying 100,000 in the first waves, the emotional landscape shifts from rage to weary introspection, where hope flickers amid the ruins of dachas and dreams deferred. This crisis probes the essence of resilience. How does a society, forged in isolation, redefine identity when the architect of its isolation flees, leaving behind a tapestry of suppressed voices now rising to claim their narrative? The philosophical pause invites reflection. What legacy lingers when control evaporates, exposing the fragility of power built on fear rather than consent? In cities from Vladivostok to Kaliningrad, spanning 11 time zones, the inner turmoil brews. Suicides among the elite climb by 20% in leaked reports, while communities forge bonds in soup kitchens serving 50,000 daily, a testament to endurance amid despair. Globally, it challenges paradigms. Nations ponder the human cost of geopolitical gambles that displace millions and destabilize economies touching 7 billion lives. For observers afar, the question lingers: does this herald a new era of accountability, or merely the prelude to fragmentation that redraws maps and minds alike? The tension coils in the soul of history itself, a pivotal fracture where personal fates intertwine with planetary destinies. Subscribe to this channel without delay, ensuring you witness the psychological rebirths and reckonings as they unfold. These inner revolutions dictate the global dawn. And in this profound hush, one certainty emerges: the true transformation has only just ignited, with humanity's core hanging in the delicate balance of what rises from the fall.